Okay, boys and girls, this is our last video on graphing sine and cosine functions. And in this video, what we're going to look at is equations of sine and cosine function and find some of its characteristics. And then we're going to look at graphs of cosine and sine functions and find those same characteristics. Now, some of this will not be on your test, and I'll tell you which part is not. However, you are required to know it for your IXLs, which is why I'm going over it. All right, so the first thing we've already talked about is that the amplitude, sine and cosine functions, their standard form is, get some black ink here, y equals a sine of bx minus c plus d, or y is equal to a cosine bx minus c plus d. Okay, and each of these variables have certain meanings that we're going to talk about today. So let's talk about a. So this value of a we've already talked about is your amplitude. So the absolute value of a is your amplitude. To find your period, you're going to use the b. The coefficient of x is going to be your period, or you're going to use it to find your period, because your period is either going to be 260 over b or 360 over b if we're doing it in degrees. And then c, we're going to use c to find our phase shift. Actually, we use both c and b to find our phase shift. Our phase shift is going to be negative c over b. And then the last thing, our phase shift tells us how it moves left or right. And then the last thing is our vertical shift. And our vertical shift tells us how it moves up or down. And then we're going to find the frequency, which is just 1 over the period, or b over 2 pi. Okay? All right, so let's get started and looking at an equation. So given this equation, we want to know what is the amplitude. Well, the amplitude is simply 3. It's the absolute value of that a value. So in this case, our amplitude is 3. Okay? To find our period, we're going to take 2 pi over b. Well, in this case, our pi, I'm trying to use the same colors to highlight it. In this case, our b is just 1 because there's an understood coefficient of 1. So our period is going, and we're in, it doesn't matter, you can either use 2 pi or 360 here. I'm just going to use 2 pi over 1. So my period is 2 pi. My domain, what is the domain for all sine functions and all cosine function? It's always negative infinity to infinity. Now our range is changing a little bit. I've always said that the range was negative a to a. That is true if there's not a vertical shift. But if there's a vertical shift, it changes our range, as we saw in the other problem. So because there is a vertical shift, our range is going to change. And the way we find the change for that range is we're going to have to look at the d value as well. So we're going to have to look at the amplitude plus or minus and add the d value. So our amplitude, our range normally would be negative 3. Our range is normally negative 3 to 3, but we're going to have to add that phase shift. So it's going to be negative 3 plus 1 and negative 3 plus 1. So that's going to make my range negative 2 to 4. Okay? So it's going to go, my lowest value is going to be negative 2. My highest value is going to be 4. And my vertical shift, we already said that was 1. Well, it is 1 because of this. And there is no phase shift here because there's no c. So there's no phase shift. And our frequency is b over 2 pi, or the reciprocal of the period. Okay? Now, this is only needed for your IXLs. You will not be asked that on a test. That's only needed for your IXLs. The same thing for the phase shift. We only need this for IXLs. Okay, so let's do another example where we're trying to find the amplitude. So we're going to look at a. So a in this case is negative 1. So the amplitude is 1, because remember the amplitude is always the absolute value. B, the period, is 2 pi over the coefficient of B. In this case, I wanted a highlighter and I got a pen. In this case, that's 2. So my period is 2 pi divided by 2, which is simply pi. My domain, what's the domain? Please, everybody say it all together now. Negative infinity to infinity. My range, now my amplitude is still 1, but it started off at -1, and then we're going to add the vertical shift to that, so that's going to be -1 minus 3, and then 1 minus 3, because my vertical shift is negative. So my range is going to be -4 to -2. My vertical shift is 3 down. And because this up here was positive, it's going to be 1 up. My phase shift here is still 0 because there's no C. And the frequency would be the reciprocal of pi, so that would be 1 over pi. I should have made these squares bigger. I know next time. Alrighty, so let's do the next one. My coefficient here is simply 1. So that makes my amplitude 1. My period is, B is 2. So my period is, once again, 2 pi over 2. So that makes my period pi. My domain, my range, it's going to be my, normally it would have gone from -1 to 1, but now it's going to go from -1 to 2, and I'm going to add 2, and then 1 and add 2. I really should have made my squares bigger. So my range, I'm just going to put my range over here since I ran out of space, is going to be 1 to 3. Vertical shift, the vertical shift is simply the value of D, which in this case is 2. And then my phase shift is -C over B. So now we have a phase shift to contend with, and that phase shift is -C over 2. So that's going to be -90 over 2, which is +45. +90 divided by 2, which is +45. So I have a phase shift of 45, or pi over 4. And my frequency is simply the reciprocal of my period. Okay? Last one. Why don't you pause the video and you try the last one, and we'll come back and talk about it. Okay? Alrighty? Well, welcome back. So our amplitude, remember we take the absolute value, so our amplitude is 2. Our period is going to be 4 over 2 pi. So that is just 1 over, that's 2 over pi. That's a little weird. I think I forgot to put a pi there, but that's okay. So it's 4, I'm sorry, I did that wrong. It's 2 pi over 4. I'm thinking the frequency. It's 2 pi over 4. So my period is pi over 2. My domain is always -infinity to infinity. My range is going to start, even though it starts at -2, I am going to add my phase shift, which I don't have a phase, I don't have a vertical shift. So my range would still be just from -2 to 2, because I don't have a vertical shift here. So my vertical shift is 0. My phase shift is pi over 4. It's C over B. So it's pi over 4, negative pi over 4. And then my period would just be 2 over pi because it's just the reciprocal. Alrighty. So remember, the period is not really that important. The vertical shift is going to be most important when you're in your IXL. So these last 2 columns here, I'm just showing you these for your IXL. So don't stress out about them if you don't get it. Okay. But you do need to be able to find your vertical shifts and your range and your domain. Okay. Now, in these problems below, we're going to find 3 things: the amplitude, the vertical shift, and the period. What I realized is that the easiest thing to find is the vertical shift. So let's start by finding our vertical shift. To find our vertical shift, we're going to take the maximum plus the minimum and divide by 2, because it's really just the average. Okay, so the maximum plus the minimum, so in this case that is 5/3 plus 1/3 divided by 2. So that is 6/3, which is 2. 6/3, which is 2 divided by 2 is 1. And you could kind of see that from the graph, that it is the vertical shift is whatever it's symmetrical about. So this is symmetrical about 1. So that means the whole graph was moved up 1 unit. Okay? Then the next thing we want to find is and from that now we can find our amplitude. So remember that amplitude is the height between the maximum and the midline. Or we can find the amplitude by doing 5/3. Well, let me just put it into the formula again. By doing the max minus the min and divide that by 2. So for the vertical shift it's plus, for the amplitude is minus. And so that's going to give us 5/3 minus 1/3, which is 4/3. And we're going to divide that by 2. I really needed more space here. So that's going to give us 2/3. But we didn't really have to do that. We can look at it and see from 1 to 5/3, we increased 2/3. And then from 1 to 1/3, we decreased by 2/3. So that's our amplitude. So we can also find it that way as well. And then our period is from the time the graph began till the time it ended. And that can be arbitrary. So it looks to me as if this graph began here at 0. It's always easy to see if the graph begins at 0. And how long did it take it before it went back to its original position? So it went back to its original because it increased, went back through 0, decreased, and then started to increase again at 0. So this is my period. And so my period is going to be pi over 2. There's a lot of stuff on this graph, and I could have made this more space. I'm sorry about that. Let me see if I can enlarge it a little bit. Okay, so again, it's easier to find our vertical shift. And our vertical shift is going to be our maximum value plus our minimum value. So that's 1 plus -2 divided by 2, which is -1/2. And again, you can kind of see that it's symmetrical about -1/2. So that's my vertical shift. My amplitude, I can do maximum minus the minimum divided by 2. So that is 3 divided by 2, 3/2. So my amplitude is 3/2. And if you notice, I started at 1/2, adding 3 at -1/2. I'm sorry. I started at -1/2, adding 3/2 to that would get me 1. If I start at -1/2 and I subtract 3/2, that'll give me my -2. Okay? And then my period, how long did it take for it to go through a full cycle? It started off at -pi over 6 and it went to 5pi over 6. So that is simply, my period is going to be 5pi over 6 minus -pi over 6, which is 6pi over 6, which is simply pi. So that's my period. I'm sorry this is so messy. This one I can do down here and maybe it won't be so messy. All right, let's find out vertical shift. It's kind of easy to see on this one that my vertical shift is -2. But if we want to do the math, we can say it is the maximum plus the minimum divided by 2. My amplitude, it's easy to see that my amplitude is 1. But again, if you want to use the formula, my amplitude would be -1 minus -3 divided by 2, which is 2 divided by 2, which is 1. My phase shift, I have to pick a starting point. So to me, I'm just going to start here. It doesn't matter. You don't want to start there. You want to start here where it was 0. So we can start here at 0. And where did it complete? Right here. So that means that it started at -5 pi over 4. It ended at 3 pi over 4. So that would be 3 pi over 4 minus -5 pi over 4, which is 8 pi over 4, or 2 pi. Let me write that out because you want to know where I got that. So it's 8 pi over 4. Yes, I want the eraser. There we go. It's 8 pi over 4, which is simply 2 pi. Okay, here's the last one, and it's not that bad. So why don't you try the last one, and then we'll come back together. Okay, so this one did not have a vertical shift. Its vertical shift was 0 because it's just right there on the axis. And when the vertical shift is 0, we can easily find the amplitude is 4. And then our period, it started at 0, it completed its period at 1. So our period here is 1. And that's all for this. And you have finished your graphing sine and cosine. You finished the trigonometric unit. And what I would like for you to do is when you do your IXLs, you only have to get to about 70%. I will count 70% as 100. So if you can do your IXL and get to 70%, it will be counted as 100.